This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. And now we are making a special appeal. If you like us, please show it. We need your support. Please give to our show by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and you'll see a big red button that says Patreon. Click on it and support us. We are counting on you. In return, every week we'll bring you episodes talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is James Loeffler. He is the Berkowitz Chair of Jewish History at the University of Virginia. He's the author of a new and much acclaimed book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century. It was recently published by Yale University Press. Professor James Loeffler, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, is your book about Jewish human rights or the role of Jews in advancing human rights universally, or both?
Both and neither. No, I think it's about, it starts with the question of what is Jewish human rights activism and where does it come from? And I think many of our assumptions are that it is an either-or proposition. Jews fighting for human rights, worried about human rights, committed to human rights in the context of a Jewish society like Israel, versus the others who may do it in a universal sense. And the goal of the book is to look back and see what roles Jews played and to see some of the surprising ways in which those stories actually overlap and are even the same one.
Tell us about how they overlap. I mean, you describe really a very intimate relationship between Jewish history, early history of Zionism in the beginning of the 20th century, when Jews needed protection. And they thought they would either get protection through political rights, meaning national rights, or through the development of universal human rights. So what is this relationship in that early stage?
Sure. So the best way to think about it is this. It's 2018. As we're speaking, it's the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you said, is a perfect example of an expression of universal rights, right, protected through international law, supported by a network of institutions and groups designed to foster it. And it's Israel's anniversary, State of Israel, 70 years, right? And we think of those as diametrically opposed stories, things that maybe they were linked in 1948 just by coincidence, right, or a cruel irony. The interesting question is when you go back further, they turn out to be really overlapping people inside the same story doing both, building that project of international rights, international law, and working for a Jewish national movement and aspiring for a nation state.
Are these two in conflict? In other words, is there a tension between national aspirations, or what you might call political, and the idea of universal human rights? In other words, some of the early advocates that you follow, the characters in your book, were not Zionists, even though they were Jewish. Mm-hmm. Why did they see a contradiction?
Well, I put it like this. I'm not sure we see it as a contradiction today, but because we see it as a kind of either-or proposition. And I think that has a lot to do with the way we think about human rights and we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the goals of the book is to go back and see what they saw. Some of these people, and I'm talking in particular about Jews that came out of Eastern Europe, they didn't see the contradiction. They thought that, the goal of national self-determination was a universal goal, as was the idea of giving people protections that went above the level of their country, because no one thought that everyone's government was going to be perfect. And so the goal was how to pursue those two things. It turned out that they were connected for many people, because this was the moment when people were reimagining and creating both the nation state as we think of it, right? The empires are crumbling, and they're creating what we think of as internationalism, international law. Both those things have a history. And human rights, as we may think of it as some kind of timeless thing, was nevertheless something that was emerging in this early 20th century period.
Do you think that this rationale stands up to scrutiny today as a scholar looking back, or studying them? Did it require a lot of logical gymnastics on their part?
Right. I think the fact is there is a tension there, but it's not any different than the tension that we often think about between liberty and equality. Right? Every democratic society goes through this. How do you balance the freedom, ideal versus the equity ideal? It's a tension. It's a tension between liberal and national. It's there. But I think it stands up to scrutiny because it's basically the animating tension that runs through so much of modern democracies. Every country goes through this, and every people, I think, has to go through this.
But it's also particularly pronounced in the case of Zionism, and as you show, many of the Jews that advocated human rights initially were also fervent Zionists. Because in Zionism, there's this key concept of the negation of the exile, shlilat hagalut. So how did they justify to themselves working for a Jewish nation state, by by implication and perhaps even explicitly working to undermine the Jewish diaspora while catering to the Jewish diaspora at the same time?
Sure. That's a great question. I would say this. So part of the goal of the book and the research I'm doing with it is to challenge our notions about Zionism. Not everyone wanted to negate the exile. Not everyone felt you had to put every Jew into, a Jew land, right? Even before they knew what they would call it and exactly where it would be. I don't think this is actually different than many of us think about what Zionism was at the outset. Theodor Herzl never imagined every Jew would leave Europe. He actually had this idea that you take some of the Jews out and you give them an address, you give them a refuge, you give them a place. That kind of normalizes their status, and it allows the diaspora to continue to flourish. So these people, in a certain sense, are no different than the millions of Jews around the world who might identify strongly with an Israel and might see its utility. They might fervently advocate for it. They might criticize it, worry about it, but they don't need to move there. And I don't think they're that different. They think about it as a place that's necessary to have a Jewish address in the international system. Now, one way to think about this also is to say, what's different between all the Jews who in the 19th century fought for Jewish freedom and rights? Historians love to talk about the fight against anti-Semitism then, crises in the Middle East that affected Jews. And the answer is the reason that these people were both Zionists and what we would call human rights activists is they believed that to achieve those rights, you had to have a status in the international arena. You couldn't just be a passive recipient. And Zionism gave them that sense of a legal identity. That's why they felt these two things went hand in hand, even if, of course, there was always a tension here or there, which if push comes to shove, do we have to choose one over the other? The political questions. But in their kishkas, right, in their guts, when they went out to do this work in the 1920s and 30s, they didn't see this as something the way we see it, as the inevitable clash between the universal goals and the particular goals.
Tell us about the fact that how you managed to create this book around these characters that you've chosen to follow. I mean, it's not just a sort of theoretical exploration or just a historical chronology of the evolution of human rights, but you focused it on these individuals. For example, I'm thinking of Jacob Robinson and Jacob Blaustein and Lauterpacht. Tell us about these people. How did you choose them? What do they have in common?
Sure. Well, they kind of found me, right? I mean, I went looking and I thought, okay, what do we know about the history of Jews and human rights? Today, one of the names that pops up all the time is this guy Hirsch Lauterpacht. He's kind of the Gödel, as you might say. He's the great hero of many international human rights lawyers. And his Jewishness is kind of taken for granted. He came from Eastern Europe. He's born before World War I in a shtetl in Poland. And then he rises up to this illustrious career, and he gives us these ideas such as crimes against humanity. He's at Nuremberg. He's at the UN. He's coming up with the very idea of an international bill of human rights. So I was interested in him and his Jewish backstory. So a couple things happened. When I went to look for his papers, I went to meet his son, who was very old at the time, a distinguished lawyer himself. And he said, I think we know everything we know about him because there's been writing about him and I've published it. But you can go look in the closet there where I have a few more things. So, I like to say in the closet were his Zionist politics, right? Because in the closet were a sheaf of writings that this guy Lauterpacht did as a young man in 1918, 1919, and so on, in Hebrew, in Polish, in Yiddish, in which he's discussing his ideas about law, his ideas about rights, his ideas about Zionism. So when I found out that there was more to the story of this person who was, getting a lot of attention and is getting a lot of attention these days from scholars and even from others, then I began to see, okay, who else is he talking to, right? So it turns out that Lauterpacht is part of this network of people. And if you see who he's corresponding with and who he's arguing with, these people kind of present themselves because it turns out, let's just take Nuremberg. You've got a whole bunch of Jewish lawyers running around the Nuremberg trials, right? And what are they doing there? They're trying to convince the Americans and the British that they have to prosecute the Nazi war criminals and really think about ideas such as genocide and crimes against humanity. They have to expand the remit of what this legal process can be. But they're also saying, can we bring in Chaim Weizmann? Because Chaim Weizmann should be able to testify as kind of an expert witness on what happened to the Jewish people. So they all seem to be running through these same circles. And Jacob Robinson, who you mentioned, another good example. This is the guy who David Ben-Gurion says, our man in Lithuania, the head of the Lithuanian Zionist movement in the 20s and 30s. And he's the man who's at Nuremberg, and he's famous for advising Justice Jackson there. So they're all kind of intersecting, and they kind of found me because they're all just in the story, as I said. And that makes it easy when you start to trace them and you realize they're all literally in the same room at this point.
But many of the ideas that relate to human rights, as you show in the book, started in Jewish or Zionist circles, whether the word Union of Jewish Students, the American Jewish Committee, and others. How did they permeate into a larger context? Who were the non-Jewish interlocutors that allowed for that transition to happen?
So one of the interesting things about this is, forget about Zionism for a second. It's interesting how much this generation of activists, and we're talking about a bunch of people, mostly men, who in the 20s and 30s are moving into these circles at the League of Nations, international law circles, and then during the war and the planning discussions happening in Washington and London. They're very close to power. And the way it goes in is they present themselves basically as experts. You need lawyers, and we're good at law. We've been thinking about this for quite some time now. And they recognize that as much as they're committed to what we would think of as internationalism, right, and alliances with other groups, some of these people spend a lot of time trying to connect with actually Germans and Lithuanians and other movements in the 20s and 30s. When push comes to shove, they realize that to make law work, to make law real, you need to get to the people with the power who are going to make the laws. And so they spend a lot of time campaigning at the League of Nations, unsuccessfully, but then again at the United Nations. They're there when it's founded, and they're presenting themselves as people who have a lot of expertise. Mind you, this is one of the interesting parts of the story that I thought was a surprise. It was a surprise to me, and I think would be to many, that Israeli diplomats are very involved in early international human rights work. Why? Partly it's because of things that we can talk about having to do with a sense of Jewish investment in this, and partly it's because they say, hey, we actually have expertise. We've been fighting for these legal principles and ideals for a couple decades now, and the United Nations, Israel's the first stop in the late 1940s and in early 50s for the UN saying, we need people who know something about conventions and law and treaties and negotiation, and you Israelis have a bunch of Jewish lawyers who've been working on this for a couple decades. It goes against our image of today, and that's one of the things that is always nice about history. It challenges our expectations about how inevitable certain things were and, how inevitable certain polarized positions are attitudes, right, about a state such as Israel, an entity such as the UN.
I want to ask you about exactly one of those surprises that I thought you were going to mention, which is that it was unexpected to me to find out that in the 20s and 30s, the Jewish leadership who's beginning to think about this stuff thinks that they may be able to make common cause with the Weimar Republic.
Right.
Why is that? And explain how that is a counterintuitive finding from your historical research.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the bottom line is, as historians often point out, it was the Nazis rose to power, taking the idea of protecting minorities in the diaspora as the justification for imperial expansion. Right? Why did the Nazis expand? Why did they go into Czechoslovakia, Austria? It's because we need to protect our fellow Germans who are a diasporic minority who need our help. And of course, the Nazis did everything they could to pervert law and and also to demonize Jews and Jewish lawyers as the people who basically have tried to use law to restrain the German nation, right? So why is it then that many of these people I'm talking about in the book are betting on Weimar Germany, right? They think in the 1920s, up until 1933, that the Germans are our best bet. Why? Well, the simple answer is it's a world of states. Germany has a state, and Germany is making all kinds of alliances, what they call Ostpolitik, because Germany basically wants to expand its influence in Eastern Europe. It wants to protect its group, and it's not Nazi at the time. And many of these people, and I'm talking particularly about Jews in places like interwar Lithuania, even Poland, they bet that we can work with these nationalist Germans who still seem to be liberal because we have a common issue. And Britain doesn't seem very interested in, helping minority groups despite its rhetoric. The U.S. is not involved in European politics at this point. It's very isolationist. France is ambivalent. So Germany is a rising power, and it seems to want to work with us. Now, many of the people I talk about in the book knew this was risky because they knew, Germany doesn't really care much about us, but as long as we can make a common cause, it's worth it. And then they realized, and this is one of the things that I found striking, they realized already in 1932 when the Nazis win a significant election, and certainly in 1933 that it's all over, that we've lost this fight and that we're not going to, if we're going to survive in Europe, we're going to have to not rely on the League of Nations anymore. We're going to have to get some great power who's willing to stand up to the Nazis, and that's going to have to be England.
Another striking counterintuitive finding that I saw in your book was that the Holocaust has had relatively little impact on the way things were forming in the realm of the human rights debate and discourse. How did that happen?
Yeah, that was surprising to me too. But it's very obvious that the Holocaust, look, the word the Holocaust doesn't even enter into the public consciousness, become the term that we use. And when I say I mean both historians, I mean also the public. I certainly also have in mind the way the Jewish world and Israeli society uses it. It's not there in the same way. Now, one reason is because when real-time events are happening, people tend to think of them in terms of the categories they already have. So for many of these people during World War II, they think this is a horrible expansion of what we've just experienced in World War I, where you have mass warfare, where you have incredible violence, and we're getting swept up in it. And there's this terrible racial ideology which is spreading. So it's new. But more importantly, the world doesn't care, right? And we tend to think of it as the world doesn't care about Jews, but the world is more focused on the aggressive warfare of the Nazis. They're more focused on these terrible crimes the Nazis are doing. And as we know, it takes time for the Jews to kind of alert the world and get world leaders to register that this kind of crime, this kind of mass extermination, what is literally being now called genocide, is something that you had to focus on by its in itself. That's kind of a complicated historical contextual answer. I can also give you a simpler one. Many of these people I'm talking about are very idealistic, but they're also very pragmatic. So the fact that millions of Jews are being exterminated is something that hurts them deeply emotionally, but they also treat it like a cold political fact. And just like Zionist leaders in the Yishuv are trying to figure out what will this mean for the numbers of Jews who will survive and, the hard but real demographic questions about conflicts between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, these human rights activists are also asking the same questions. Can you protect us as a minority if we've shrunk to such a small number inside these societies where we don't factor anymore, right? And some of them are willing to say, in 1943, we mentioned Jacob Robinson, he says, the terrible thing that's happened here isn't the mass violence against us. It's that we've lost our place in the economy, that as a group we're no longer viable. And if we can't survive as a group, then if we can't factor into that, then it doesn't matter to go saying don't discriminate against us or protect our rights, right? That's not the way these systems work, because that's just not the way the world works.
But I think one of the interesting outcomes of this is the realization, the stark realization once and for all, that states alone cannot be depended upon to protect their minorities, and there is a need for international mechanisms. And this is one of the most interesting themes, I think, that you raise in the book that really isn't just about Jews. It has to do with the ongoing tension to this very day between the idea of an international mechanism for enforcing the principles of human rights, which somehow threatens sovereignty. Can you explain that tension?
Absolutely. The best way to think about it is to go back to 1948 and to say, okay, the fact that the United Nations is recognizing a Jewish nation state, right, and wants to, forget about what Jews want, what Palestinians want, that the world community, so to speak, wants to build states and divide up lands and build states, is a recognition that sovereignty is the best way to protect people. It's the most stable arrangement, right? On the other hand, you're watching a moment in which they're creating international law, and they're envisioning a whole system of laws that are going to restrain sovereignty. We can't trust states. We need something above them, right? We need a court to backstop it, or we need a referee, or we need a system. That's what the human rights law is supposed to do, right? So it's a recognition both that sovereignty is sort of the way the world works, but sovereignty is dangerous too. And many of the people inside this story recognize that, and they recognize that this is a challenge for us to negotiate. It's a challenge for everyone to negotiate, because we need to create an order to the world. And the liberal nation state is the best bet now. Empires are just going to the dustbin. And this seems to be the most stable format we can choose. But we also want to be able to temper that sovereignty.
Right. I mean, here's where words become important, because you talk about the attitude that maybe sovereignty needs to be regulated or tempered. But I think that in today's rhetoric, the resistance against human rights by international regimes of human rights by many governments, they would view it as violating their sovereignty, or at least they say it's a violation of their sovereignty, perhaps because of their interests in not having this hang over their head. Israel being one of those countries, and in the past, as you point out, the U.S., which didn't want to participate in the creation of the International Criminal Court. Tell us more about some of these examples about particular human rights innovations at the time You mentioned the International Criminal Court, Convention on Refugees, and the kind of pushback they received.
Sure. So here's a great example. Jacob Robinson is the man I mentioned. He starts his life in Lithuania. He becomes active in protecting Jewish rights and larger question of minority rights. He ends up at Nuremberg, and then he ends up in the Israeli legation, as they called it, at the UN as their legal advisor in the 40s. He's the man who helps with the whole Israeli diplomatic case for partition and for recognition of the state. So what happens to him? So he actually is the person who pushes forward the International Refugee Convention and is very proud that Israel is doing that. He also views it as necessary. He also works on the International Criminal Court in the early 1950s on behalf of Israel. And he comes away disillusioned because he says it's not about what the Arabs want or what we fear. It's about the fact that the great powers won't do this. The U.S., France, Great Britain, they're killing this idea of having an international criminal court. And so he also says, don't ask us anymore to be the guinea pigs or to go out on a limb to protect international law when the big boys in the room are basically ambivalent about it. So you have to think about it from the perspective of a small state saying, what do we do and what don't we do? And then he gets into arguments with other people in the story, with Lauterpacht, who say, no, Israel should do more. Israel, and it's just like today, Israel should do more just because such and such a country is ambivalent or antagonistic towards human rights and zealously guarding its sovereignty. Israel should do more. And Jacob Robinson's answer, like many today, is, well, we've done a lot. And this is not necessarily worth the reward of being out on a limb to take bigger risks about our sovereignty. So that tension is there. And I think that is the roots of something that grows over time. And Jacob Robinson is a man of the center left, but certainly those ideas move strongly into parts of Israeli political culture. And then it's sovereigntism, right?
So that tension has grown over time. It hasn't diminished at all. There's even more tension now between the idea of international human rights or universal justice and national sovereignty?
That's a great question. I would say this, that tension has it didn't necessarily grow over time on whole. One of the things I try and point out in the book is that human rights is not identical to all multilateralism. It's not identical, right, to participation in international organizations. We know, and the political scientists often point out, Israel does a lot of engagement with lots of different kinds of international organizations, even as it is, we know the story, has this deep ambivalence and conflict with human rights institutions, right? So I think over time, that sovereignty, internationalism tension did subside. It did diminish, but certain things became flashpoints and grew, and certainly that happened for Israel and for many countries. So yeah, it's a tension that goes back to the beginning, and it has to do with the kind of sense of, well, we've been in this rodeo before, and this isn't a new challenge for us, and therefore we have to really weigh it.
So how do you think your book could inform the current debate on human rights, on this clash between human rights and sovereignty, nationalism, etc.?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing we have to say is there's a collective amnesia today. I think of it as the parts of the left, not all the left, but parts of the left in Israeli society and more globally see the dangers of populism, and they want to kind of dismiss all nationalism, right? And they want to say nationalism is the culprit. And they also want to say that if we just embrace human rights as kind of an ideal, we'll get where we need to go. And parts of the right have now demonized human rights, and this is true in Israel in particular, where you see it as kind of human rights are anti-Semitic, right? They've somehow become the antithesis of the nation state, right? And my point, it gets to the question we were just discussing, my point is that there is a tension there, but it's all about a balance, right? And that creative tension, that balance has been there all along. It didn't stop the creation of a Jewish nation state. It didn't stop the creation of an international human rights system. So the extremes have become more and more polarized, especially in people's imagination. And I think what this kind of book aspires to do is to at least force a reconsideration that it was inevitable this happened and these things could not be in agreement or in dialogue with one another, that they were nationalism, internationalism were destined to always clash. I don't think that's the case. So what do we need to do? I think many people on the right and left would agree. We want to get back to some sense of balance and proportion. So we can argue where that line is, right? We can argue where the right line is. But if we imagine them as in a total binary, an extreme dichotomy, then we'll never be able to think more creatively about how to reconcile them.
Well, I think maybe this is actually the fundamental point of tension. I mean, I think your book highlights very clearly that actually national aspirations go hand in hand with human rights protection in those early stages in the Jewish leaders who were promoting human rights. So who better than the Jews knows that promoting human rights is also parcel with national aspirations. And maybe that's precisely why there's so much pushback against Palestinians demanding human rights, because they know that it is fundamentally linked to their national aspirations. What do you think of that?
Yeah,
That's
I think
part of the collective amnesia, isn't it?
I think it is part of that. But there's another lesson we can draw from this, which is that, the way I often think about it, in the book I describe 1948 as a failed partition, right? The dream for many of these activists was you use politics, you use states to erect some kind of international human rights system, this law, which will then take on a life of its own and will not be politicized, right? And will be independent and able to restrain the power of the state. It's kind of a paradox, right? You need to use politics to separate protection from politics. And that split doesn't happen because for many of the things we've described, the ideal of an international criminal court, many of the things at the UN that were supposed to be depoliticized, it didn't take place. That's a story that I think Jews and Israelis and those who focus on that are well aware of that politicized dimension. But the other partition was Palestine, right? It was supposed to be two states. And the people in this book, they didn't all agree about exactly what version of Zionism should prevail. But they just assumed there would be two states by this point, and that didn't happen. So that's a long preamble to saying, I think one message of this book is human rights will not solve this conflict, right? What the Palestinians have experienced is also the problem of statelessness and the weakness of human rights to really, stabilize the society and give the dignity and give the justice that they want and deserve.
Is it the weakness of human rights, or is it the attempt, which I think we see a lot in the Israeli discourse, to say human rights must not be political? In a way, you're saying it cannot not be political.
Right. Well, what I'm really saying is that human rights can't substitute for Palestinian statehood.
Well, I think isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, so maybe that's the same thing. Now, but that doesn't resolve the question of then, that politicians, pundits, and everybody wants to say, which is, what's the price of statehood? What's the legitimate way to pursue it? And that kind of thing. But one thing I say at the end of the book is, there is a line of critique that's emerged from people who are strongly identified with Palestinian society, studying it and studying the effects of the occupation. And the line of critique also says that Palestinian human rights organizations, cannot do the work of politics, right? They can't stand up and represent the Palestinians. And they can point out the sins of Israel and they can point out real day-to-day problems, but they can't substitute for it, right? And that's a dilemma that I do think goes 1948. And that leaves open the question where you go from here. But there's kind of an over-reliance that human rights can do the work of state building somehow, when it can't. It's supposed to critique states, but you have an asymmetry here. You have a state and a non-state.
You quote in the book this line by Hannah Arendt, and I quote here, "A people can be a minority somewhere only if they are majorities somewhere else." Do you think that this paradigm failed? In light of today's politics?
That's a great question. I don't think it failed. I think it worked for Jews. And
for Jews, but she's
talking
about
the whole point. It's not supposed to be just for
She's talking
Jews.
more broadly, more generally, isn't
right,
she?
she's talking more broadly, more generally. But the point is, we have to ask for different cases. Some cases it worked, some cases it failed. So, it's very clear that, and this is important, I do want to talk about Jews for a second. Why did it work for Jews? Well, I think it made life a lot easier for American Jews. One of the things I talk about in the book, and this is timely in light of the debates today about anti-Zionism and non-Zionism in American Jewish life. Jacob Blaustein is a good example of someone who is ambivalent to opposed to Zionism, but after 1948, he comes to embrace and accept it. He's still a critic of many Israeli policies and concerned about a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Israel. But he says, basically, this makes life easier for us. Now we can be kind of a model minority in America because we have a place where Jewish nationhood will live, and we have that addressed. For other groups, this is a problem, and I think this is an ongoing problem that bears out the truth of our end statement, that to be a minority somewhere still requires, a kin state still requires someone out there in the world who will advocate for you and give you a certain legitimacy. The Palestinians are a perfect example of this, as many on the right often point out correctly. Palestinians have suffered in the Arab political world because they don't have any true representation, so others always speak for them. And then that is the dilemma of, not having that majorityhood that might allow them to pursue their own politics differently.
Well, in some ways, though, this is a segue to something I wanted to ask, which is that it seems that many of the processes that led Jews to be so on the forefront of advancing minority rights were because they were a minority. It's almost a truism. Have the processes that led Jews to be in that position changed now that Jews are a majority in their own state? Are we going through fundamentally different experiences that makes us simply not have such a great interest in minority protections anymore?
It's not polite to say that, but I think it's true.
We ask non-polite questions. Isn't that what we're here for?
One of the biggest challenges we see is that Jews hold strongly to a memory of minority identity and persecution. But the Jewish question, so to speak, was solved by putting Jews into the majority, right? A Jewish nation state was created, and then it enshrined Jewishness into the state. And more importantly, it just made them the population majority. And the same thing happened in the U.S. because Jews were coded as part of the white majority. And there's certainly diversity inside the Jewish world, but basically the U.S. has a racial problem and Jews don't have to deal with it. So Jews became the majority there too. And the troubled spots in the Arab Middle East and in the Soviet Union, the communist world, where Jews were a minority, those Jews were effectively evacuated, right? They were moved into other places where they could be part of the majority. So now we have a challenge because Jews are still a vulnerable community and a minority in a sense of facing anti-Semitism in Europe and in America. And yet they're also not the same as they were. And the investment in the global project is more complicated too. Now, what's happened, what we can see is two things that are interrelated. Number one, Jews have begun to look for other sources of inspiration for their thoughts about how to fight for human rights. One is religion, right? It's not coincidental that you have religious motivations now, and we now hear Jews, particularly in North America, when they speak about why they care about human rights, they may say the Holocaust. They may also say something like Tikkun Olam, right? And they may also reference aspects of religious Judaism, which they say are moral and religious imperatives. That's a new phenomenon. One of the things in the book that was striking to me is even the rabbi in the book doesn't talk much about religion, right? He's inspired much more by this worldly politics and historical questions and legal questions. So religion is back. And the other thing is the discourse of how Jews think about minorityness and about anti-Semitism. A lot of it is around religious freedom, which is a term which has a new connotation in the context of American politics too, and thinking about persecuted Christians and who cares about them and why. It's more a term of the right in American politics. So that's changed a lot. And the fact is, you can't just rely on the idea that Jews are a minority, because the final thing I'll say about it is, as many people know, in America, the left is ambivalent about whether the Jews count as a minority, right? Because they're seen as very different and don't have the right skin color, and they don't fit in the same way, and they're connected to Israel and all those things that are the subject of much discussion and debate today.
But I guess I would say that I still think that there's a fundamental difference between the Jewish collective memory in America of being a minority, which expresses itself in solidarity with other minorities, and the fact that such a large majority of Jews vote for the Democratic Party, which is still quite different from the historical memory of Israeli Jews, who maybe retain the victimhood, but don't really retain the sense of needing to support minority rights, given that they're trying to protect the majority. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. And one way to think about it is that, Israeli Jews take the lesson of, we don't want to be like the Europeans, because we know how that story ended for us. But we also need to understand that now we have the chance to be the majority and we need to protect ourselves, right? And that security is the lesson we take away from it. And American Jews have the luxury, frankly, of feeling like, well, we have the security, and so we want to remember the experience and we want to imagine solidarity in a different way. I mean, there are different memory cultures, definitely. I think that does have to do with the different experiences and what people focus on.
Well, we certainly understood a lot about the roots of human rights. So, James Loeffler, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. And please subscribe on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts and perks. Check out our archive with almost 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. We are called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.